What's up guys, Xbox Tech Junkie back today with another video. Today I'm going to be talking about the final book in the Forerunner Saga, Halo Silentium, written by the late and great Greg Bear. So let's just jump right into it. Written in 2013, this book, when I first saw it, made more sense to me as far as a cover goes, because when I first saw Halo Cryptum and Primordium back in the day when they released, I was thoroughly confused on how they were about Halo because nothing about those covers screamed Halo. However, nowadays I understand that they're concept art and that I really love them in. And I'm sorry, Greg Bear, I questioned you, but I shouldn't have. So the way this interview is going to work is going to be just a little bit different than some of my previous videos. And that's because there are so many different things going on in this book that it's hard to just try to keep like one story going and then talk about the next and then talk about the next, because this book isn't told from one perspective like it was in the first two books. Whereas book one was about Born Stellar, book two was about Chakis, this one is told from various perspectives of different people throughout the entire book, such as Born Stellar, the Didact, the Librarian, Master Builder, catalogs. Like there's just so many characters whose perspective you're getting that it's hard to maintain just one. So what I'm going to do is my best to kind of summarize each one of their specific stories and try to describe to you best of what's going on. Now, what makes this book just a little complex is how often it jumps around from character to character. The two main ones are obviously going to be the Librarian and the Didact, as you can see from the cover. So what I'm going to do is try to do my best to kind of stick with one storyline and then jump to the next. I was originally going to just keep going by chapter, where one minute I'm talking about the Librarian, then the Didact, then the Librarian, and the Didact, but it made things way too complex and confusing for the video, so I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible. So let's just jump right into it. Basically, the way this works is that the judicial rate, basically the judicial rate of the Forerunners, has sent out these catalogs, these Forerunners who basically go out and investigate crimes against the mantle, and they basically record testimonies from the various people they are, assigned to. Right at the very beginning, a catalog goes to the domain and speaks with the Harspice, and I very much always mispronounce that name, and I'm very sorry for everyone who probably knows how to pronounce it way better than I. I'll put it right here on the screen for you to read, and you may know how to pronounce it better than I will, but irregardless, essentially what's important to know about this rule is that they are kind of like the in-between Forerunners and the domain. Essentially, you come to Harspice first and say, I would like to see this part of the domain or this piece of evidence from the domain. Like whatever it is, he's essentially your librarian of the domain. Now, originally, this catalog says that it wants to investigate crimes against the mantle. It would like to see the relevant information regarding the disappearance of the precursors. While Harspice would love to give him access, he says, no, get out of here. And this catalog, a little taken aback, essentially says, well, I have like priority one clearance from like the Master Judicial, like you have to give me access. And Harspice says, man, that's great to hear, but still, no, get out of here. And so just before this catalog was like, well, I essentially have the power to take you out and access it myself, the domain itself says, actually, let him in, I want to testify, which was very curious to both Harspice and the catalog, because the Foreigners don't designate the domain as a living being. They designate it as like a living information, like a living intelligence, almost like an Ancilla, but not quite there. And so it's here that we find out that the domain is not very happy, which I wonder why. All right, so starting out with the Librarian. Now, the Librarian has a very interesting story to tell in this book, because she's essentially doing one of two things. One, she is getting the galaxy ready for reseeding, but she's also testifying to the catalog about her time researching the origins of the flood, which is just so exciting to finally learn about. Now, obviously, after humanity was defeated and de-evolutionized back to their more primitive state, the Librarian said it's important to start researching the flood to see if we can find a cure, figure out how to stop it. So she requests for a ship. The Librarian takes a crew out to Pathkathona, a small dwarf galaxy that was once inhabited by the precursors. And it's here that the first bit of signs of the flood came to be. Now, instead of discovering the origins of the flood, what she actually discovers is more of the origins of the division of the precursors and the Forerunners. They come across this planet that has signs of like very primitive forerunners, like a different tribe of forerunners. And that may sound a little weird because technically aren't the librarian and the descendants of ancient foreigners. Yes, what I mean by this is it's like a different tribe of foreigners who stayed at Path Chthona and did not return to the Milky Way galaxy. So they're much different in their technological advancements. In fact, they're actually more primitive than the foreigners we see. They're still living in things like huts. They have a language that just doesn't make sense to the librarian and her team. It's all very interesting things. However, two things happen, or at least one thing happens, and another thing is discovered that's really intriguing. First, while the librarian's investigating these foreigners who, don't speak her language and none of the translation software can even figure out what the hell they're saying, she gets bitten by one of these foreigners that for a brief moment kind of stresses, her out, but then it suddenly allows her to understand their language. And it's through here that she's able to get a greater grasp on what's been happening here, their origins, their histories, and it's also where she discovers that somehow, some way, these foreigners have made their own version of the domain, a more biological living domain, which again, very confusing, complex to talk about, but in essence, it's the same thing as the regular domain that the other foreigners use. Now, again, this is just testimony being told by the librarian. All the events of her researching the flood happened roughly 1,000 years ago. So, it's hard again to try to jump between her talking about all this while the flood's getting ready to consume Earth and also recognizing okay, now we're 1,000 years ago. It's a lot of back and forth, which is what makes this book so confusing. But what's really cool about this is we finally get to learn more about how the precursors fell, why there's another tribe of foreigners out here, and how the flood came to be. So roughly 1 million, probably way more million, 10 million years ago roughly, precursors had said, foreigners, you will be the holders of the mantle. And foreigners said, sounds great, my guy. Eons would go by and the foreigners would become a little bit more selfish and narcissistic about themselves, and that's just not what the precursors wanted. So then they looked at the next rate, humans, who they made, and said, humans, you will be the holders of the mantle. And the foreigners did not like that one bit. So what they did was they would go to Path Chthona and take civil war, to the precursors and fight their creators. Eventually, we do know that the foreigners would win. They would completely defeat the precursors. And now, again, this is considered one of the greatest crimes against the mantle, because the idea of the mantle is to protect all life. And now for the foreigners for themselves to just uprise and kill their creators, that's the greatest crime you could commit. So two things happened. There were foreigners who, again, just did not resonate with that well. It didn't sit well with them. They felt disgusted with themselves, so they exiled themselves in Path Chthona on this little planet, and their descendants would live on their lives on this planet with none of the technology that they once had. The other bit of foreigners would return to the Milky Way galaxy, but instead of saying, we defeated the precursors, we're all that, they actually wiped their own memories and the memories of everyone around them, to the point where that no one really remembers what happened with the precursors, where they went, why they disappeared, and they don't even remember their greatest crime was committed by their own, themselves. It's on this planet that the librarian discovers all this, because she is bitten by one of these foreigners who descended from the tribe that stayed in Path Chthona. This bite allowed the librarian to essentially kind of almost be imprinted upon by this other foreigner and gain their knowledge and gain their perspective and experiences. And it's here that she discovers her entire species' greatest sin. Now, at the end of this entire expedition, the librarian feels that she's failed because she didn't technically find the origin of the flood. When I did discuss briefly about the powdered substance, that wasn't from her trip. That was in fact from something going on elsewhere in the galaxy. When it comes to the Year Didact, his story is a little more terrible, so to speak, with what's going on. Where the librarian's having this grand old time talking about her research and exploring this outside planet, the Didact is just essentially going through hell. The last time we see him is in Halo Cryptum, right when him, Bornstellar, Chakas, and Riser are all captured by the Master Builder. Each one of them is sent elsewhere. For the Didact, he was sent to the Burn. Now, what the Burn is essentially a term used to describe flood-controlled areas of the galaxy. Essentially, it's just an abandoned part of space that is only consumed by the flood, and people are left there essentially just to die by the flood, which is a greater bit of hell than anyone could ever ask for. And it's on this Burn where essentially the Didact is left to die because he has no armor, no ancilla, and just no way of getting back to the galaxy. However, when he is on this, he does come across a couple of other Forerunners and a catalog, or at least a damaged catalog. And it's kind of through this catalog that we're able to even understand what is happening with the Didact. It's these Forerunners and the catalog that kind of update the Didact on what's been going on. Like, hey, you know, like the Ecumene was attacked, Maithrian has fallen, the Master Builders return, all this fun grand stuff that the Didact's just missing while he's basically sitting in purgatory. But it's also here where the Didact gets captured once again. Remember, he's essentially captured for the third time. The first time is when he goes into exile, when he's originally or basically found by Bornstellar. The second time is when he's captured by the Master Builder and sent to the Burn, and now for the third time he is captured by none other than the Primordial. And now I know you're probably saying, James, okay, this timeline's really throwing me off. You just said the Primordial died in Halo Primordium. Does this take place? And if so, when? Because the Primordium should be on Installation 07. Well, again, you gotta remember the Primordial is a grave mine. And so he's not captured by the original body of the Primordial. He's just essentially captured by another grave mine who is still, in fact, the Primordial. And it's here where the grave mine itself kind of gives its own testimony to the Didact. Also drives him insane. One of the craziest things about the Flood is their ability to really just mess with your mind. Because you got to think about it, like, there's just knowledge that they know that just no real human can, not really human, no living thing can comprehend or take. For example, when the Primordial first showed up in the Milky Way galaxy, which according to this book was roughly 9 million years ago, the first time it's questioned by ancient humans, its answers were so deep and complex that it drove these humans mad. Unless you have read Halo Epitaph or this book, you've always kind of understood that the Didact's a bad guy. You know, the moment he wakes up in Halo 4, he's just comes out swinging. He's attacking the Chief. He's preparing to compose all of humanity, basically kill off all humans and bring the Foreigners back to the galaxy. Like, it's just one thing after another of how bad this dude is. And it's not because he's just a bad person. It is simply because of this moment in the book where everything really changes for the Didact. It's here we find out that talking to the Primordial for anyone is just not a smart idea, because you just get slowly and more insane. You just start to lose your marbles. And that's what happened to these ancient humans that first interrogated the Primordial. It's what happened to Mendicant Bias when he was, just having a conversation with him for 43 years, and it's why he went crazy. Just anytime you talk to the Primordial, you pretty much just gotta come to the fact that you're gonna go crazy. Oftentimes when I think about how the Gravemind or the Primordial would speak, it's very much that same eerie voice used in Halo 3. Not in Halo 2. The Halo 2 voice is creepy, but the Halo 3 voice that the Gravemind has sometimes when it's talking to Chief, like when your vision would become distorted, that like multiple sounding voices just all at one time. Some sound like super creepy, some sound very persuasive, just all of these different voices. And that's how I imagine it right here on page 166 when the Primordial captures the Didact, because he says, "Didact, do you have a moment? Just a moment. That's all it will take." I don't know why, but the way that just sounds so eerie to me that it's like it's unnerving to even think about for the Didact. And it's also kind of here that like this conversation that's about to happen between the Didact and the Primordial isn't a normal conversation like a one where they're just talking to one another. It's more of like a mental conversation that the Primordial is burning into the Didact's brain. At least that's the word he uses. When asked about his second interview with the Primordial, the Didact says, "Not an interview, a deep burning brand. An upwelling of hidden genetic content. So many things I would never have imagined, things I cannot repeat, lest I lose what remains of my sanity, my warrior soul." So again, it's this conversation between the didact and the primordial that is just searing itself into his brain and causing him to see things that no mortal person should see. So it's through the didact's testimony and through the Gravemind's conversation with him about how the flood came to be. And I'm going to read you a quick little excerpt from page 174 of, like, essentially where the flood originated from. So he's talking about what happened after the, Forerunners chased the precursors back to the path of Chthona and attacked them. You drove us from our galaxy, our field of labor. You chased us across the middle distance to another home and destroyed that home. Did all that you could to destroy every one of us. A few were spared. Some adopted new strategies for survival. They went dormant. Others became dust that could regenerate our past forms. Time rendered this dust defective. It brought only disease and miseries, but that was good, and we saw the misery and found it good. Our urge to create is immutable. We must create, but the beings we create shall never again reach out in strength against us. All that is created will suffer. So as you can see, like, after the Forerunners essentially wiped out almost all the precursors, many tried to survive in different methods. One of them was turning into dust. That dust was supposed to mutate back into their original forms at one point. However, it became corrupted like data and became disease, and that disease became the flood. Now, what this powdery substance is it's hard to explain. What happens is ancient humans found this little bit of powder on an abandoned ship outside of the Milky Way galaxy. They brought it back to our galaxy because, hey, why not? It couldn't be anything dangerous, could it? And they found that this powder, when it came in contact with their pets known as the Pharaoh, it made like desirable mutations on the animals, mutations that humans really enjoyed, and was kind of like a style thing for their pets. And so they began to, deliberately put it on all their pets excessively. But eventually, as we know with the flood, that's not something you want to do, because after a while, these mutations, while at first started off nice, started to mutate even further and be able to come in contact and infect the owners. And this essentially started the original infection of the flood. Now, this is going to be really weird to hear, but this is actually where I'm going to end the video. And the reason why is because that is only within the first 180 so pages. This is a densely packed bit of lore in this book. Not simply because of like Primordium, it's just a lot, but because there's just still so many storylines that are being told that I feel like if I try to shove it in one video, it's not going to be a good video. So we're going to sit here for part 1 of this video. Part 2, we will get into the fall of the Forerunner Empire, the rise of the Halo race, and the beginning of the modern Halo universe. Thank you so much for watching. Have a good one.